Friedman with us, joining us on a working lunch with Nordin. Matt, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.
And we're going to dig into some really interesting issues. When we first discussed getting on the show, I think a month or so ago, the world was a different place. So I'm going to be asking you a bunch of stuff, of course, around the issues around human trafficking and also you've got a vast experience also with pandemic management as well, as well as being an author. And I think we could spend half an hour reading your resume, which is good fun. But I think what we'd like to learn from you, and especially is some of the stuff I'm going to ask you later, though, on impact of the recent conflict in Russia and Ukraine. And its impact on human trafficking. I'm going to save that for a bit later. But could you tell us a little bit about yourself and a bit of what the Mekong Club is doing in this part of the world?
Yes, my name is Matt Friedman. I've been working on the issue of modern slavery and human trafficking for about 35 years. I started with the U.S. government and then went to the United Nations and then eventually set up an organization called the Mekong Club. The Mekong Club works with the private sector in a positive, supportive way to help them to understand the issue of what is human trafficking, what is modern slavery, and how does it affect their business. So we have a business association. It has basically 4 categories: banking and finance, retail, manufacturing, and hospitality. And this community meets on a regular basis to debate and discuss and identify what needs to be done to address modern slavery. As part of that process, we do an assessment of all the organizations, and we give them consultations, trainings, and offer tools that allow for the private sector to educate themselves, and then if they find issues related to modern slavery, to address them. And so we do this because out of the 40 million people in modern slavery, 16 million of them are associated with supply chains, and as a result of that, the private sector needs to be involved.
I want to start more on understanding the private sector and the supply chains. When we talk about slavery, in my mind, it's something that it's the imagery of American slavery, whether it's South or North America. People going on ships and in chains, and of course the African communities. But what is modern slavery compared to that imagery of that Hollywood imagery of slavery? What is happening now, and what is different from then compared to now?
Well, let me give you an example. A young 15-year-old boy is tricked onto going onto a fishing boat in Thailand. He's told that it'll go out for a couple of months. It'll come back. He'll catch a bunch of fish, make some money. When he gets on the boat goes out, but it doesn't come back after 3 months. It stays out for 4 years. During the time he's there, he will be forced to work 16, 17 hours a day, every day. If he doesn't, he gets beaten. He gets tortured. The only food he'll eat the entire time he's there is rice and fish. They often give stimulants to get him to work. If he gets injured or sick, they throw him off the side of the boat. At the end of the 4 years, the boat comes in. He goes to the captain and says, "Give me something." Captain says, "Go away. You're illegally in my country." So the characteristics of modern slavery are when you have a situation where a person is forced to work, can't leave the situation, is held in place, and they don't get paid. I'm not talking about a factory that cheats people and pays them under what the minimum wage is. If a person can walk away from the situation, it's not modern slavery. It's when they are trapped in it and held in it that it becomes designated as this. The last thing I'll say is human trafficking, modern slavery, basically the same thing. They just call it modern slavery because modern slavery focuses more on the exploitation, what a person experienced as part of this process.
Okay. So the line in the sand is whether or not someone can effectively get out of that situation. And if I'm looking at kind of the modern supply chain, we're talking about global supply chains. We're talking about what goes on in one country impacting another. Now, one of the things I always think about is foreign labor, and countries all around the world are exporting labor. People are importing labor. People are are then in a third country. It could be a developed country like the US or Australia, or it could be a developing country like Malaysia or Thailand. What are some of the things that are red flags for corporations to avoid, so they're not put on a list for modern slavery?
Okay, there's a number of indicators. I'll just give you a few of them. One is passport or document retention. Let's say that you have a migrant from Nepal who ends up in Malaysia. If that person's documents are taken and he or she doesn't have access to it, that's a red flag for modern slavery. If you have a person who is indebted, so that they went to a recruitment agency, they were told that they needed to pay $1,500, they signed the agreement, and then when they got to the destination location, they didn't realize the interest and the fees and everything else, and $1,500 quickly became $3,000 or $4,000. And they decided they wanted to go home and were told they couldn't because they owed this money and they were held in place. That indebtedness is a red flag. If you have a situation where a person can't leave the factory, if you have a situation where the person basically is being hit or tortured or threatened in any kind of a situation. These are the types of red flags that we see on a regular basis. One more I'll mention is, let's say the person signed a contract in Nepal in Nepalese, but then got to the destination country, was forced to sign another contract in another language, didn't understand what the contract was. Those contracts often kind of cheat the person out of money. All of those things fall under the category of forced labor, modern slavery, and human trafficking, and they're red flags for corporations.
Okay. Now, Mariam has asked us a question around the concept of poverty and as a root cause. Is poverty a root cause, or is it people cheating other people? What is your experience here?
What poverty offers is an opportunity for people to be exploited because of desperation. If you are in a situation where you're desperately poor, or a family member needs to go into the hospital, or you have tremendous debt, then you accept whatever comes your way. And traffickers know that. And so that poverty is a contributing factor, but it's usually poverty plus plus. It's poverty plus an incident in their life. If we look at Ukraine, for example, the vulnerability of all those people crossing over into Poland and other countries offers the opportunity of traffickers going in and basically, exploiting people in a forced labor, modern slavery situation.
That was going to be my kicker discussion around this whole Ukraine-Russian conflict. We've seen, Russia has been in Ukraine for a few years now, but now they've upped the ante and pushed in towards the capital. And you've seen hundreds of thousands of people in the last few days exit Ukraine. And I saw the footage, and I'm like most of us, just switching between BBC, CNN, Sky News, the even checking out Russia Today every once in a while. But I see these stations set up on the other side of the border where there's people quote unquote helping, and I hope they are.
Yes.
But I'm just thinking, if I was a modern slaver, that's like the bear at the that famous footage of the bear at the top of the waterfall as the salmon are jumping up.
Yeah,
Just
exactly.
open your mouth and they'll jump in.
Yes.
What are the risk factors that now corporations, you mentioned corporation supply chains. Now, what about countries that are neighboring conflict zones, and what should they be doing?
Well, let's use some of the earlier migrant issues as an example to see what will probably happen in this particular situation. Initially, a lot of people will be in those camps, those refugee places. They'll be logged in and so forth. The traffickers don't get them then. They get them a little bit later, once things settle down and people are looking for options. So when you see the number of people who are leaving Syria, for example, or Northern Africa, many of them paid to be smuggled across. The moment you create that payment, you create a debt, and that debt leads you to basically owing somebody. And that owing is the justification for a person being trafficked or being forced into an outcome at the end of that particular process. So what we often hear is that human traffickers fish in the stream of migration, very much like those bears you were talking about. They just wait for one to go by who looks vulnerable, and the next one, and the next one. And with so many people displaced and so many people in situations where they don't really know what to do, it's easy to go as a trafficker and lie about, I got this great job, you just come with me. Maybe the young girl will be taken off to a brothel or to a sweatshop or to someplace else. It's an extremely vulnerable time for these people, because not only do they have, to a certain extent, a sense of poverty because they don't necessarily have money in their pocket, but they have that other aspect, desperation. You put those two together, it's a formula for people being exploited.
Mm-hmm. Now, when we talk about other big issues, when we talk about the pandemic now, we've seen a huge amount of movement of people, and then we've seen with COVID-19 a lockdown of people. How has that impacted the movement of human traffickers and the movement of modern slaves? Has that had any impact, or are there things still going as normal because they're moving through rat trails, or like the example you gave in terms of the boat? What is your experience there?
Yeah, a lot of people think that human trafficking is cross border. It certainly does happen that way, but you also have trafficking within a country from one district to another or from one side of the street to the other. So let's look at Bangladesh as an example. You have a woman working in a garment factory. She has a good paying job. She's supporting 6 or 7 people. The pandemic hits. All of a sudden, factory closes. The orders dry up. They can't get the goods off to the West. And so she doesn't have her job. She's then put into a quarantine situation where she's forced to stay in her home with 5 other family members. They have no savings. The only way they're going to survive is to borrow money. They borrow the money, they're indebted. As a result of not being able to pay it back, the person comes and says, well, I need a family member to come with me and work for 6 months or a year to pay that debt off. So we anticipate the estimated number of people, which is about 40 million people around the world, to go from 40 to up to 60 million because of the pandemic, because of the indebtedness, because of the desperation, because of the fact that people need to make up for the fact that they owe money or they lost things along the way. And so, yes, the pandemic has had a devastating impact on modern slavery.
Mm-hmm. Now, Anne has asked us about countries like Australia. There are obviously laws in Australia against human trafficking, but what are some of the things that, in Australia, no one would, think about human trafficking. It wouldn't they're more worried about the football and the cricket. But in terms of that underbelly, that we see, you mentioned the sex trade, you mentioned indebtedness. How much modern slavery I mean, I've got 28 different questions. I apologize for giving them all at once. How much modern slavery is going on in developed countries underneath our noses that we don't notice?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people feel like the issue would be less developed countries, but let's use the United States. There are estimates that anywhere between 400 to 700,000 people are in exploitative forced labor type circumstances in the United States. That includes sex trafficking, domestic helpers, the people who go in and pick the tomatoes and the other agricultural things and so forth. Australia, I think the number is around 20,000. I think that number is low. I think it's actually higher because if you add sex trafficking and some of the more rural agriculture and mining type things, you would find that there is indebtedness associated with it in those locations. The issue is that, and the reason why people don't talk about it is they don't know about it. I mean, I did tours across New Zealand, Australia, Malaysia, Singapore, Canada, the United States to talk about this issue. And I was always surprised at how little people actually knew about the topic. If you don't know about a topic, you're not going to care. If you don't care, you're not going to open your eyes to it. So I think what's really needed is a lot more general awareness to really help people to have kind of a framework in their mind. What is this thing that we call modern slavery? How does it work? How does it relate to sex trafficking or forced labor? And what needs to be done in order to address it?
Mm-hmm. Now, Matt, tell us a little bit about your recent book. And what are you trying to educate all stakeholders with what you've written there?
Well, the name of the book is "Where Were You," and I'll just give the "Where Were You" story. You know, years ago
I
when
want
I
to
was,
make sure I get a copy of that. I know you're in Hong Kong. Let's
yeah,
see it. Yeah, you got to sign it and you got to send it to me.
yeah, I'm happy to
You know,
do that.
I collect signed copies of books, so I really
I'm
want that.
I'm happy to
Sorry,
do
I
that.
interrupt
I'll
you.
come
Go
up with
ahead.
something to say that's interesting. So I worked on this topic for 30 years. I worked on sex trafficking for a long time. Forced labor is something that came a little bit later. But years ago, when I was in Nepal as a public health officer, I desperately wanted to do something to help address this issue. So I decided to write a book. As part of this book process, I went from shelter to shelter to interview the women and the girls. I went to one shelter. There was a girl named Gita. And every time I approached her, she said, "No, no, no, no. I don't want to talk to you." But she sat and listened to all the interviews. When I finished and I was leaving, Gita comes running up and says, "I changed my mind." So she sat on one side of the table. The rest of us sat on the other side of the table. In over a 3 hour period, she literally told the worst story I'd ever heard of rape and torture, disease and betrayal and murder. I honestly didn't know what to say to her. So finally, I turned to Gita and I said, "Wow, Gita, you must be so angry at those traffickers for the horrific things they did to you." She paused and paused. And she said, "No, I'm angry at you and you and you." She pointed at us. She said, "Where were you?" She said that every single day she woke up praying for somebody to come and help. Nobody came. Said she went to school till she was 12. She knew that everything around here was right out in the open. Nobody was doing anything. She said that she wasn't angry at the traffickers. She said they're just bad people being bad people. She said she was angry at the good people, at society for not caring enough to allow a 15-year-old girl to be commercially raped 7,000 times only to eventually get AIDS and she was dying. So I use that as my lead story to basically help people to understand that there are 40 million people in modern slavery, 25,100 enter per day. And the number of people that we help annually is 0.2% of the victims. The only way we're going to be able to address this issue is if we, the communities of the world, say it's unacceptable for 4.8 million women and girls to be in forced prostitution and another 25 million people to be in forced labor. We have to draw a line in the sand and say it's got to stop.
Hmm. Now, Anne has brought up issues within China, and you've mentioned Nepal and some other countries. Are there, smart consultants out there who often draw up lists of who's got the most forced labor, who's dealing with this issue better? What what are what are some of the areas of the world, and what are some of the countries that are really at the extremes? Who's doing it well in terms of reducing forced labor, modern slavery, and who's not getting it right?
Okay, so there, in terms of the country that has the most, it would be India, estimated at 18 million. China second at around 3 million, and then you get into Bangladesh and a few other countries down the line. Those numbers are high, but in some ways, what you have to do is not look at the sheer number of people who are considered to be modern slaves, but the per capita amount. So those are countries like North Korea, Sudan, Cuba's on the list, various other ones where it's identified that they have human rights violations that are just not being watched by anyone. They don't really have any systems, processes, and procedures in place. Interestingly, Brazil is considered to be one of the countries that has taken this issue and really done things with it. They have mobile courts where, whenever a court case needs to be done, rather than bringing it into the capital, they go to the communities in the jungle and they sort out the issues there. They have basically investigative journalists that are paid to go and identify human trafficking cases in order to highlight them. They have a list of organizations that have been identified as having modern slavery, and law enforcement has been pretty good about addressing it. I have to just, in a general way, say that there's no country that doesn't have this issue. Every country in the world has something related to this. And when it comes to governments and the United Nations, they haven't really done nearly as much as the non-government organizations. But where I think we're going to have the breakthroughs, and this is the reason why I left the more public sector to join the private sector, is the private sector. Private sector knows how to do audits. They know how to identify bad business and address it. The banks have to be concerned about this because if they don't, it's money laundering. So they're trying to figure out which companies are having issues and problems so they can basically give suspicious transaction reports to the regulators, et cetera, et cetera. The point is that the private sector has a very pivotal, important role to play, and we're beginning to see more and more of that take place.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I wanted to ask, Mariam's also brought up this issue around women and children specifically. And for me, I want to kind of blend that with what you were saying about the corporations. What can corporations do specifically? And I recently read a whole bunch of anti-slavery policies, from different corporations. But is okay, policies, are we getting it right at getting the policy right, or what has to happen beyond just acknowledging it through a policy? What are
Yeah.
your thoughts there, Matt?
Yeah, policy is only as good as the action that goes behind it. If I were to be consulting with an organization, we would do a self-assessment with them and then sit down with them for a couple of hours and say, this is where your limitations are. There needs to be leadership. The C-suite and the board need to understand the issue and have contact. You need point people, either a team or individuals or somebody who is the lead on this. You have to look at your codes of conduct, your policy statements, and have them cascade into your supply chain so that basically it's not just your organization, but it goes into tier 1, tier 2, and 3. You have to have training for all of those different sites in the language that people can understand it. You need to have risk assessment mechanisms in order to kind of identify where your risk is and what are the risky products. And if you have migrants, what do you need to do to address it? You need to actually have audits that have grievance mechanisms built into it. You have to then have a remediation plan and approach. If you find it, what do you do in order to protect your business?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, that's a lot of work. I think there's a lot of work there. But for me, what is the risk of not doing it? What happens if a company doesn't do it, and what happens to them in the global supply chain? How long does it take for them to be, put in cold storage, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we've been seeing, we did an analysis where we looked at 10 organizations that found themselves in kind of a naming and shaming situation related to modern slavery. And the average loss of revenue was about 64 million US dollars. And that's loss of revenue and market share and various other things. For the banks, it's even more damaging. There was a bank in Australia that was fined 1.3 billion Australian dollars because of online sexual exploitation of children that took place with their transaction mechanisms. Hotels are now in a situation in the United States that if there is sex trafficking taking place in the hotel and they can prove that, hotels are being sued and they're actually winning those cases. And, $250,000 or $500,000 or $1 million, and the insurance companies now don't want to basically insure the hotels. And so with ESG basically becoming a prominent force in tracking what companies are doing or not doing related to the world, to animals, to the planet, to people, et cetera, you're going to see that it's an imperative. You have to be focusing on this, because if you don't, you are going to be left out by the investors, and the consumers are going to know that too.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I wanted to ask, and brought up another issue, that workers have to pay a lot of money to get work. Is that part of the modern slavery equation, or is that part of a business practice? Again, I'm still trying to understand the line.
Okay, so let's take a scenario and start from the beginning point to, let's say, Malaysia. So you have a Nepalese person making 30 US dollars a month in his community. A recruitment agent goes to him and says, how would you like to make $250 in Malaysia? Okay, what do I have to do? You have to put up $1,500. I don't have $1,500. Don't worry about it. We'll lend it to you. You'll pay it back. This person's never had that kind of money, doesn't know anything about interest, doesn't know anything about fees. They sign an agreement, $1,500 immediately becomes $2,500, $3,000. And by the time they get to Malaysia, they have this debt, and they also have all kinds of restrictions and fees that they have to pay in Malaysia. So this person started off thinking they were going to be better off, only realizing that for the next 3 or 4 years, they don't get paid anything at all. So what companies are doing is they are going, let's say you're a brand and you're working with a factory in a particular location. The brand will go and say, we will not work with you if any of your employees have debt. So you need to either make sure that they don't have debt, or you have to pay that debt, because we're not going to work with you, because we then get the designation of forced labor or modern slavery if anyone finds out that you have that scenario. So as a result of this situation, you have this kind of situation where people are in very difficult circumstances. They thought they were going to have a better life. They didn't get a better life. They got something a lot worse. And this happens all over the place. So corporations are now looking at the recruitment process to ensure that the recruitment process does not either inflict this pain and suffering on the migrants, but also the pain and suffering that could be on them as well.
Mm-hmm. I want to come back to the refugee issue, if possible, and again look at what's going on with Ukraine and Russia. Now, all of those, hundreds of thousands of people are moving into Poland and all those countries, and then will often end up in other countries like Germany, France. And what is the level of the burden of proof on those companies? And is there a mechanism to deal with refugees differently than those who have been forced into modern slavery? What's the situation there, Matt?
Well, I mean, you have three different types of companies. Some that follow the rules and regulations to the T. And if they were going to take a refugee in, they would go through the paperwork, they would go through the agreements, they would have the signatures and so forth. That's one extreme. The other extreme would be people who see that these people can be gotten for very little money, and nobody's really looking at their factory or their business, and so we just pay them under the table, and if they start working, we're giving them $5 a day, and we need them to work another 4 hours at night. We just basically say, you're going to lose your job. We're going to throw you out. We're going to tell people that you're working illegally, et cetera, et cetera. And so you're able to manipulate them. And then the category somewhere in between where, maybe they are following some of the rules, but they're not following a lot. What we're dealing with is that far right category where you basically have people who are unscrupulous. They're just trying to get more profit, and they realize that they can take advantage of these individuals. Going back to the Syria situation, in Turkey, there are a lot of sweatshops that were set up simply because there were so many workers that had nothing and basically just wanted room and board, a place to live, and they would end up working 16, 17 hours a day. In a way, they have a choice, but in many ways they don't. They have no place to go. They can't go out into the street because the authorities would catch them. So it's another way of exploiting people. And when it comes to people who are most able to be exploited, it's often migrants.
Now, Matt, we're almost out of time. I wanted to ask you I always like to ask these CEO silver bullet questions, as a CEO, as a C-suite, watching this show, what is the one thing I should do today that ensures that I'm not going to have this problem tomorrow?
Read about the issue. It could be through all of the kind of amazing websites that are out there that help to educate and inform. My book was a textbook to help people to understand what they need to know about human trafficking. But awareness. And what's interesting is I get in front of 100 people in an audience. And I do 150 presentations a year. And at the end of my presentations, I usually get 8 or 10 people that come up afterwards and say, oh my gosh, there's something about this issue that's in my DNA. It really bothers me. I can't stop myself from coming up and saying, what can I do to help? And that's the way causes are. We don't pick our causes kind of pick us. And as a result of that, what we do is we tap into those people and we give them all the resources they can so that when they go back to their company, they kind of infect the company within with good on knowing what this issue is and what needs to be done and so forth. And if that goes all the way up to the C-suite, and C-suite understands that they should be focusing on this not only because it kind of protects the company, but because it's also the right thing to do, then you have a scenario where you're going to see companies step up, get involved, and really make a difference. And there's a lot of companies that we've worked with that have crossed over into that leadership role of really wanting to be leaders in addressing this, because the moral repugnance of what we're talking about here bothers them so much that they want the world to be a better place, and they realize that they have a role to play in doing that.
Brilliant. I'm excited. I'm looking forward to getting my hands on that signed copy of your book. Where to get the book actually? Where do we get our hands on this book?
It's a Random Penguin House book. So it's available in Singapore. It should be in Malaysia, Thailand, Hong Kong, or Amazon, or the book repository. It's very easy to get copies of the book.
All right, brilliant, brilliant. Matt, I want to thank you for your time today. I'm excited to dig into this issue further. I'm hoping to get you on one of our panel sessions for the Malaysia Global Business Forum as well. This is going to be an important issue that we want to deal with here in Malaysia. But I think it's also a global issue that's not going to go away anytime soon. Talking about tens of millions of people.
Yeah, I just want to say that I've done a lot of work in Malaysia. Malaysians are very compassionate, empathetic, caring people, and when they understand the issue, they're going to want to kind of step up and fix it. And so, thank you very much for the opportunity to be on this today. And I'm happy to answer any questions. The makeonclub.org is easily accessible. And thank you for bringing up this really important topic.
My pleasure, Matt, and I look forward to our next conversation. And I want to thank everyone for joining us on A Working Lunch with Nordin, and we'll see you again next week. Thank you very much.